So, good afternoon. Welcome to this edition of the NITheCS Colloquium. There are many people that we usually don't see here on a Monday afternoon. So my name is Francesco Petruccione. I'm the director of NITheCS. Yeah? And today is a very special colloquium because for the first time ever, we don't have a scientist talking. Yeah? And, and we are very, very glad to have Professor JP Smit from Stellenbosch University. He has a very minimalistic biography on the announcement. The only thing that I managed to extract from him is that he did his PhD in Cambridge, but otherwise he's quite Stellenbosch linked. Yeah, and just to keep it short, because people are here to listen to him and not to me. JP, thank you very much for agreeing to give this talk. And I hope it will be the first of a series of many interactions between science and humanities, yeah? Because I believe that the problems of this world are so complicated that science alone won't solve them, and the humanities alone either. Yeah? So we need to look for each other and try to do the right things. Yeah. So JP, thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you very much, Francisco, and thank you, everybody, for joining today. I want to point out to Francisco that feel free, you don't have to be so apologetic that you say we have a non-scientist. Philosophers, historically, we view ourselves as the birthplace of the scientists, and by birthplace we mean better. So there tends to be a sort of arrogance to the discipline that is not really much of a problem. So my talk I've called Philosophy of Language, what we've learned in the last 120 years. And as you can imagine, well, so put it this way, I thought about the best way to do the talk is try and figure out if I had to tell people who are not experts about philosophy of language, things that they should know that may or may not be useful to them, what would I tell them, right? And most of the subject isn't like that. I mean, most subjects aren't like that. I mean, I don't need to know what happens, say, in the chemistry labs here or to understand it. Most disciplines are not so that everyone has to know everything about it. That's why we have a division of labor in society. And most philosophy of language is like that as well. We think we know an awful lot of stuff, but I've just sort of pulled out a couple of things that I think are worth talking about. One little qualifier, which I won't make again, is this is an exceptionally opinionated introduction. If you ask 5 philosophers of language what the subject is about or what you do or what's important, you'll get 6 answers. That's just the way it works. So, and a lot of the things here that I say are actually going to be controversial, but I'm not going to bother marking them as such. In broad brushstrokes, this is what we believe. The way I conceptualize it, that's definitely not something most people would agree with. In any case, I decided to call it What We've Learned in 120 Years because in 1905, Bertrand Russell publishes On Denoting. And On Denoting is sort of the birth of what we call today analytic philosophy. Western philosophy at the start of the 20th century splits into 2 parts, analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. It's called continental because mostly it happens in continental Europe. And in analytic philosophy, it starts a period of roughly 50 years where philosophy of language is first philosophy, by which I mean consider it the most important subject or the first subject you need to know, or in many cases, the only subject you need to know. So there's sort of an incredible heyday to philosophy of language, which then very much fades. It's still a very established part of the discipline, but in what do most philosophers do? I think philosophy of language ranks about 5th. Number 1 now is ethics, followed by metaphysics, something like that. In any case, Russell at the time is busy writing Principia Mathematica with Whitehead. And the key idea there, and that's the link with computationalism, is to try and show that logic, that mathematics can be derived from logic. So Russell lives in an amazing time, and a time that he's also partially responsible for. For thousands of years, for the most part, logic was thought to be a settled subject. Aristotle had basically done it, and while we can clean up a little bit around the edges, logic was thought to be settled. That has been figured out. Then it's only sort of, well, there were exceptions, but for the most part in the 1800s and 1900s, where the realization hits that no, actually what Aristotelian logic is only a tiny subpart of logic. And we get the birth of modern formal logic, the stuff that looks very much like mathematics. And So here's this fundamentally new tool developed by people like Boole, who the scientists presumably would know of, Pino, and then also Frege, and then also to a degree Russell. Here's this fundamentally new tool, and the thought is that given we now finally have this tool, maybe we can finally get somewhere with philosophy, right? The thought is, well, we have all these historical philosophical debates. They seem to drag on and drag on and drag on and not go anywhere. But now with the modern logic, maybe finally we can sort it out. So there's a great ambition and a great optimism at the start of this project. Now, while Russell is writing Principia, so doing this very, very technical work, he gets stuck on a problem. And then one day a little thought occurs to him. He sends it off, the paper On Denoting, to Mind. They publish it, and it births a new philosophy. Now, the key idea in On Denoting is that natural language grammar is a poor guide to underlying logical form. And this leads to confusion and nonsense in philosophy. The idea at the beginning is, well, you have these natural language expressions that philosophers argue in, and this is not only restricted to philosophy. The thought is this nonsense exists across all academic disciplines, but mostly in philosophy. But if we translate them into the modern formal logic, we can either resolve them or show them to be nonsense. And in fact, what we'll often find, Russell thought, not always, the positivists thought always, Russell thought often, is that the great philosophical debates of the past are mostly nonsense or confusion. They shouldn't exist in the first place. So natural language grammar allows us to say things that are meaningless. Chomsky's got a famous example, green ideas sleep furiously, right? Now that's a grammatical sentence, green ideas sleep furiously. In the formal language, or in, say, a programming language or in mathematics, you cannot do that. A programming language will tell you, okay, syntax error if you just write down gibberish. Or in mathematics, if I write down 5 square root negative equality square root, that means nothing, right? It's just complete gibberish. In a formal language, if you can state in the formal language, then it's supposed to have a meaning if it's a well-constructed formal language. Natural languages are not like that. That's problem one. It allows for claims that are meaningless to be formulated in them. So what formal logic tries to do is it tries to capture the logical form of statements. Now, what do they mean by logical form? I'm not going to show it to you because it'll take a little while, but the key idea is the following. Take the following two arguments. First one is the classic one. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Socrates is mortal. You all understand, right? All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Socrates is mortal. Now, if I have a different argument, all people are crazy. Bob is a person. Bob is crazy. Now, it's obvious that what makes those two arguments valid is the same thing. It's some structural thing that has nothing to do with the detail about Socrates. It's nothing to do with the detail about Bob or mortality or craziness, right? So what formal logic tries to do is it tries to capture the parts there that matter, the way in which these two arguments are identical. So it abstracts away from the way these two arguments differ, and it tries to formally represent what makes both of them valid. Because in those two cases, what makes them valid is the exact same thing. And that's what we call logical form. So logic tries to construct, tries to show logical form. And the idea is, well, once we've put the arguments of philosophy in this form, some of them will be shown to be, well, basically syntax errors and rubbish, not well-formed formulae. And other ones we'll finally be able to solve. So that's the great ambition at the start of this project. So one task then, of course, the one part is to do the logic, to show the symbolic expressions relate to one another. The other task is that of translating natural language expressions into the formal language that captures such logical form. And that's what most people in philosophy of language do, and part of how they understand themselves. Again, this is an opinionated introduction. I'm leaving out a lot, but that's one part of what people try and do. I've got one little example I'm going to run through quickly of this sort of idea. So let's say you have an argument or a set of claims that contain names, what we ordinarily call names. So JP or Toyota or Stellenbosch or South Africa or Trump or whatever. Now, how do we translate the name into a formal language? Well, it would be natural to think names just mean what they refer to. All I need to know about this use of Francesco is it refers to him, and then I know everything there is to know about using the name Francesco. That's a sort of sensible thought, right? So the idea is we can translate natural language names into the formal language by using a rule like, well, same reference, same constant let. So if they have the same referent, then they mean the same. We can translate them using the same constant, right? That's the idea. So the idea is names just mean what they refer to. But what people discover when they start trying to do this sort of thing is, whoa, language turns out to be really difficult and complicated. Translating from the natural language into the formal language is very, very tricky, and disputes about every little thing come up immediately. That's why philosophers of language tend to be one of the more antagonistic groups in philosophy. If you want to see a blood sport, you should look at philosophy of language conferences or paper reviews in philosophy of language. People, the only thing all philosophers of language fully agree on is I'm a genius and everyone else is an idiot. That's sort of the core foundational belief of the discipline. So take just this little example, right? Frege's classic example, he points out, but there's a problem with that. If we say Hesperus is phosphorus, so that's a true claim. That's the Greek word for the evening star and the morning star. Phosphorus is the morning star, Hesperus is the evening star, also known as the planet Venus, right? Hesperus is phosphorus seems to mean something different from Hesperus is Hesperus. But if Hesperus and phosphorus both just mean what they refer to, and to capture the meaning is just to know what they refer to, then it shouldn't. But as Frege points out, the first one is a discovery. Different cultures discovered it at different times. And it's an empirical claim that we can we can imagine it to be true or false. Whereas the second one is an obvious tautology. Everyone knows Hesperus is true because everything is identical to itself. So immediately with the idea that, well, if you want to translate names to the formal language, you just go by same reference, same constant. That immediately fails, or seems to fail. Still a lot of defenders of it. Or another example, let's say you take a claim like Vulcan does not exist. Vulcan, this use of Vulcan that I'm using here is for an intramercurial planet. So the same trick that physicists pulled in other contexts with planetary motion, they saw there's some strange disturbance in the motion of Mercury around the sun that doesn't quite add up. Then they thought that they would pull the Neptune trick and realize, there must be another planet. So they thought there must be a planet between Mercury and the sun, and they decided to call this planet Vulcan. That's in fact where the Star Wars usage comes from. But then, of course, turns out, no, there's no such thing. In fact, you can have a lot of fun on Wikipedia on the category list of planets that don't exist, because astronomers tried it quite often. Turns out the strange orbit of Mercury is due to relativistic effects because it's so close to the sun. It's not because there's another planet. So Vulcan doesn't refer, and yet the sentence Vulcan does not exist is meaningful, right? And it's true. But if a name needs a reference in order to be meaningful, if the reference is its meaning, then Vulcan should be meaningless. And so Vulcan does not exist should be only a partial proposition. The first part should mean nothing. But clearly that's false, right? So then, and I've got etc. there because I'm not going to drag you down through the debate. Then there's the views that Russell and Frege then subsequently held, that actually the meaning of a name is given by a definite description. That's something a guy called Saul Kripke destroys much further down the line. And so the debate has gone on forevermore. I know a fair bit about names. I wrote my doctorate thesis about it. It's a shockingly complicated topic, and it's a nice little sort of case to study, because if we can't even figure out names, it's not clear we can figure out anything. So that's sort of how philosophy of language is normally done. We've got all these trouble cases, an enormous amount of them, and then we try and construct theories that explain these trouble cases. And there's an enormous amount of quite sophisticated theories available. Some things people agree on, a lot that they don't. We're going to leave that part of it there. That's the ordinary, everyday thing that philosophers of language and analytic philosophy do. That's the sort of thing that I do. What, however, do ordinary people need to know? Well, start from this. So there are still people in philosophy of language, it happens quite often, who come up with a claim and then say it's of much broader importance to, say, philosophy of mind or to metaphysics or sometimes to philosophy of religion. This idea of showing that all or many philosophical problems are due to nonsense, that's Russellian idea, that sort of fades fast from 1950 onwards. There, philosophy of language becomes still important, but less important. Philosophy of mind, political philosophy, ethics, metaphysics, they sort of start taking over. And so it remains a core part of philosophy of language, but it's nowhere near first philosophy anymore. In fact, the subject is now mostly studied for its sort of intrinsic interest, like, you know, the way pretty much everything else is studied. Personally, I'm still optimistic about the Russellian project. I do think, and I'm going to talk about that today a little bit later, that there's a lot of ways we get misled by language very, very often, and that it causes all sorts of intellectual trouble. I'm personally convinced of that sort of semi-positivistic project, but we're going to get back to that. For the most part, the subject nowadays is studied for its intrinsic interest. Things worth knowing. I've got 3 things worth knowing that I'm going to tell you about. I kind of thought, well, if I have to explain to people who don't know the subject one thing about philosophy of language, and I can only say one thing, what would I explain to them? And I decided, well, I would explain the distinction between semantics and pragmatics, just because the two are so closely related and yet utterly, utterly different. People say all sorts of things about meaning, especially in the humanities. We'll get to that later on. They make claims like meaning is always shifting, meaning is contingent, meaning is contextual. And if you work in philosophy of language, then that's where you just want to run away screaming, right? For reasons that I'm going to talk about later. Part of why that is a tough thing to talk about if you don't know what you're talking about is because people always run a couple of things at least together. What words mean and what people mean, or what words mean and what people use the words to communicate. So I'll give you a very, very easy example. So normally, a bit of terminology. What words mean, we call that semantics. What people use words to communicate, we call that pragmatics. So first one, this terminology is from a guy called Kent Bach, what we call near-side pragmatics. So let's say we're getting ready to go play tennis, me and Bob, and I'm wondering if Bob is ready to go play tennis, and I ask, is Bob ready? And someone says, okay, Bob is ready. Now, semantically, all I've said there is Bob is ready. But clearly what I've communicated is Bob is ready to go play tennis, or what's been communicated to me. Everyone with me? The idea here is it's very easy to fall into the trap of thinking our linguistic expressions and our language sort of tries to capture all or most of what we communicate. That's just not so. Language is a tool, one of the tools that we use to communicate, and it's a very important one, but communication is a much broader category than just what happens in language, right? So Bob is ready just means what it does, and in a certain sense, it's always true of anybody, right? If I ask, is Francesco ready? Well, someone who took that literally can always answer yes, because you're always ready for something, even if it's, you know, ready to take a nap. But what it communicates is, say, Francesco is ready to listen to the talk, Francesco is ready to go have dinner, Francesco is ready to whatever. But in my way of construing it, and there are philosophers who are holdouts on this question, like I said, this is opinionated. There's what the words mean, and then there's what we use the words to communicate. So near-side pragmatics, that's pretty much what you need to do to a sentence to get it to something that can be true or false. So even to get to something that can be true or false, typically you have to abandon the sentence and go to a different entity, what is communicated, and the sentence is a clue as to what's communicated. It's not the same thing as necessarily as what's communicated. Another example that I absolutely love, a very classic example, although I'm going to give a atypical construal of it. Don't worry about that. I said this is opinionated. Take the following 2 sentences. So the monkeys ate the bananas, they were happy. The monkeys ate the bananas, they were happy. What does they refer to? The monkeys, right? Now I've got the monkeys ate the bananas, they were ripe. What does they refer to? The bananas, right? So here we have 2 sentences. In a sense, they mean, we have 2 sets of 2 sentences. We have 2 sentences. It means what it means. But we can the way you interpret the they differs radically based on how you understand what the other person is trying to tell you. And that subject gets very, very complicated. That's part of why when people started with great naivety, with the idea of teaching computers how to communicate with us, then it turns out, well, that's difficult because before you can communicate with someone, you have to share a lot of beliefs with them. And in principle, to interpret what someone's trying to tell you, any belief about the world can become relevant. In this case, to know that they refers to the monkeys in one case, you need to know monkeys are the kinds of things that can be happy. To know that bananas in the other case is what's being communicated with the word they, you need to know bananas are the kinds of things that can be ripe. So you need what computer science nowadays called the sort of world model. Before you can communicate, you need to have a world and a world model that you understand for this sort of, in this case, what's almost like disambiguation. So that's the sort of stuff that's considered in near-side pragmatics, like what we need to do to an uttered sentence to get it to something that's true or false. But then there's something called far-side pragmatics. That's once you have the full sentence, there are other things you can communicate without uttering the sentence. So the classic example is, let's say there's Sarah. Sarah has been a student for 3 years, and she asked me to write a reference. And I write, to whom it may concern, Sarah has been a student in our department for 3 years. Sarah has excellent handwriting. Signed, JP Smit. Now, what the words mean is a compliment. Sarah has excellent handwriting. What they communicate is this person's awful. Don't hire them under any circumstances, right? Because we know the convention for writing a letter of reference is you say all the good things that you can. And in this case, it's conscious and explicit, right? The other person knows I want them to catch on to the fact that this is the only good thing I can think of with this person. They're awful, don't hire them. So communication happens, but the language is a tiny part of it. It's an essential part. It's evidence as to what you're trying to communicate, but it's not quite the most important or the first sort of impulse that starts the communicative process. Now, the general picture you get from this is what someone called Robin Carson calls pragmatics first. When we think of communication, you start with pragmatics, the fact that we communicate. Sometimes we use bits of language, sometimes we don't. The example I love is from Carson. She gives the example of you're standing at a bar, you've had a couple of beers, someone walks over to the bar, they look at you, they kind of hold up a beer and kind of, but it's noisy in there, so just kind of hold up the beer and look at you, and then you know they're asking, do you want another beer, right? If they go holding up the beer, they look at you. So that communicates, do you want another beer? And it fully happens by pragmatics. Then we can start adding bits of language. They can also hold up the beer and go, beer, or they can ask another one, and so on and so forth. And you can get to the point where, as we sometimes do in written language, where you literally write out everything that you're trying to communicate. But the first thing worth knowing, there's a huge difference. These are two very, very different things, semantics and pragmatics. There's what the words mean, and then there's what we use the words to communicate. And of course, we can use the term meaning for both in a certain sense. I'm going to come back to this, because I'm going to try and show you later on how this leads to nothing but chaos and confusion. Second thing worth knowing. This is the one I'm by far most passionate about. This is ultimately the sort of main object of my research in philosophy of language. Language or concepts can lead us into nonsense. There's this idea originating with people like Frege and Russell, although you can also find it elsewhere, that, as I explained before, you can have bits of language that are grammatical, but they express nothing, or nothing useful, or nothing that can be true or false. In fact, we can have a third category for them, the category of nonsense. So this is something philosophers have accused each other of a fair bit, and I'm going to give you some examples of that. But first, to just explain a Russellian version of this idea. So I told you Russell says, well, surface grammar is a poor guide to underlying logical form. Here's a nice example from an article by A.J. Ayer. Well, adapted from A.J. Ayer. So take those two sentences. Nothing is better than a hamburger, and pizza is better than a hamburger. So grammatically, they're equivalent, right? But pizza there is being used as a term denoting a kind of thing. Nothing is not being used in that sense. So despite the fact that there's some grammatical place, they're not the same kinds of terms at all. So this is what leads to those kind of jokes you find in Lewis Carroll books and so on. So not a Lewis Carroll example, but let's say, take the first claim, nothing is better than a hamburger. If you go to a restaurant, you ask the waiter, okay, kind of thinking of a hamburger, is there anything better? And the waiter says, nothing's better than a hamburger. And you say, awesome, I want nothing instead, because nothing is better, right? That's the kind of mistake that in theory this could lead you into. It's a toy example, obviously, as I say there, But that's the kind of mistake that Russell is talking about. Because pizza, you could say, well, bring me pizza instead. That would work just fine. Doesn't work with nothing. Point is, pizza is a name for a kind of dish. Nothing is not the name for a kind of thing. That's the, but grammatically they're identical. And when you, an underlying logical form, those things are distinguished. If you were to formalize these two sentences, they would look nothing alike. They would look utterly, utterly different. So Eyre uses this example because he uses a quote from Heidegger to give as his paradigm example of a bit of nonsense. Heidegger is the very famous German philosopher. So I'm going to read you the Heidegger quote. Notice two things. One, it sounds exceptionally profound. The second thing I will tell you about later. So here's Heidegger. Oh, and every time I say being, it's with a capital B. Heidegger says, only being ought to be explored, and beside that, nothing. Being alone and further, nothing. Being solely and beyond that, nothing. How about this nothing? Is there the nothing only because there's the not that is negation? Or is it the other way around? Is there negation and the not only because there is the nothing? We assert the nothing is more fundamental than the not and negation. Where are we to look for the nothing? How are we to find the nothing? We know the nothing. Anxiety reveals the nothing. That for which and about which we made ourselves anxious was really nothing. In fact, the nothing itself as such was there. How does this nothing? And then he ends with the famous line, the nothing itself nothings. So if you ask, what does the nothing do? Well, the answer is the nothing nothings, right? Now, the toy example about nothing is better than a hamburger, that's obvious. People make jokes about that sort of thing. It's clear what mistake happens there to make the joke work, where you tell someone, if nothing's better than a hamburger, then rather bring me nothing, right? Eyre says, Heidegger, and whether it's fair to Heidegger is a different story because he is doing phenomenology. Ignore that for now. He says Heidegger makes the exact same mistake. He treats the nothing as a name for a kind of thing, as opposed to just a way of saying it is not the case that, right? If you say nothing is better than a hamburger, that's just a way of saying it is not the case that there is an X such that that X is better than a hamburger. That's roughly how we'd express it in formal logic. And the point is, if you do that, if you rewrite the sentence in that way, you cannot then form sentences like these Heideggerian sentences, right? So the idea is formal logic, once we translate natural language expressions to formal logic, some of it will be just shown to be nonsense. You cannot even write it down and still have the same inferences or the same results if you write it down in formal logic. So this is why Wittgenstein says he's not solving problems, he's dissolving them. Once you realize that something like nothing is better than a hamburger just means it's not the case that there's such a thing, such that that thing is better than a hamburger, instead of meaning there's a thing, the nothing, then the problem isn't solved, the problem goes away. You realize it was never a problem to begin with. And that's what gives rise to the Wittgensteinian and the positivist and the later linguistic analysis attitude. The idea that the way to do philosophy is to show people that they've made kinds of linguistic mistakes that have led to them speaking utter gibberish. They've produced sentences that in natural language are, grammatical. But ultimately, philosophy disputes, the claim was, are total nonsense. To illustrate this thing about the nothing, it's kind of interesting. I always give it to my class. And then I ask them, do you know what it means? And typically they kind of say they do. But I've graded their essays, right? So I know that the fact that they claim they think it means something doesn't mean much. But then I ask them, okay, let's ask what I think is the central question of philosophy of language. What are you talking about? And what I mean by what are you talking about is not can you produce more sentences, can you fit it in a paragraph, can you get 90% in a test, is can you tell me in reality what has to be the case if it's true and what has to be the case if it's false. So I always ask them to do the following. Close your eyes for a second. Now think about the nothing nothings. Now imagine a world in which the nothing nothings. Now imagine a world in which the nothing somethings. Now imagine a world in which the nothing nothings, but only on a Tuesday. Right? As I'm sure you will find, is while the sentence is grammatical and while you can kind of catch the flavor of what Heidegger is doing, there's a coherence to it. In the most literal possible sense, you don't know what he's talking about, right? What is the case in reality if this claim is true, and what is the case in reality if this claim is false? And that's that sort of idea that drives a lot of first half of the 20th century analytic philosophy, that these mistakes exist. That philosophical mistakes are a bit like two people arguing whether the number 5 travels fast or slow, right? The answer is not that it travels fast, and it's also not that it travels slow. It's that the number 5 is not the kind of thing that can travel. It is, as Russell would put it, a kind of category mistake. And so then the idea to translate into formal logic, just you translate it into a language that captures everything that's correct, but gets rid of the confusion. Here's another toy example, again from Air, just a toy example. He has an imaginary illness, seems to presuppose an ontology of two kinds of objects. You have real illnesses and imaginary illnesses. So some people have real illnesses, some people have imaginary illnesses. But that's just a matter of grammar, right? And there are philosophers who've been misled by this sort of locution, not going to get into that now. If you just rewrite it as he's not ill but he thinks he is, then all that immediately becomes nonsense. And that's what Russell does in On Denoting to a different set of claims containing what we call definite descriptions. He shows how certain things that lead to very complex philosophical problems, if we just translate them, if we express them differently, the problem just kind of goes away. Understand? So these kind of Heideggerian problems, and then these sorts of toy examples. Now the problem with this project has always been that philosophers have struggled to come up with beautiful examples of genuine philosophical problems where they can clearly show to everyone's satisfaction, turns out this is just nonsense, turns out this part is legitimate. If we separate it out, there's actually 5 problems mixed up, 4 are nonsense, 1's a real problem but not that hard to solve. That was the idea. That didn't quite pan out. Something about the project clearly was misguided. And the question is it the core of the project or just the way people were sort of developing it? But that's the key idea behind it, right? There's this idea that language misleads us. And maybe it's not even language, maybe it's concepts, something in our thoughts. And we can get to this point where we say things, but in a very, very real sense, we have no idea what we're saying. Or as I expressed it, we have no idea what we're talking about. Now, where does this nonsense come from? I think it's very clear that this sort of nonsense does exist. And I'm going to talk through an example with you to close the talk in a little bit. The claim that such nonsense does exist has been a perennial part of philosophy if you go looking for it and you go hunting for it. And not only in analytic philosophy, you can also find it in people who we'd say are definitely more continental inclined. There's a lovely quote here that I put on the last page because I wanted it to be up while I answer questions. This is what Schopenhauer says about Hegel. It's one of my favorite quotes I've ever found. Schopenhauer, not a person anyone would confuse for a positivist or an analytic philosopher. Schopenhauer, the great pessimist. This was his claim about Hegel, with my italics. Talking about Hegel, he says there's a tendency of minds to operate with such abstract and too widely comprehended concepts has shown itself at almost all times. Ultimately, it may be due to a certain indolence of the intellect, which finds it too onerous to be always controlling thought through perception. Gradually, such unduly wide concepts are then used like algebraic symbols and cast about here and there like them. In this way, philosophy degenerates into a mere combining, a kind of lengthy reckoning, which, like all reckoning and calculating, employs and requires only the lower faculties. In fact, there ultimately results from this a mere display of words, the most monstrous example of which is afforded us by the mind-destroying Hegelianism, where it is carried to the extent of pure nonsense. So Schopenhauer was a great enemy of Hegel. In fact, he also scheduled his classes so they're opposite Hegel, which wasn't a great idea because Hegel was a lot more popular. But it's this impulse. If you go hunting in different bits of philosophy, you can often find it here, right? And there's something I think that must be right about that. Sometimes we talk about something and we know what we're talking about. There are other ways though, right? You don't necessarily need to know what you're talking about in order to produce sentences that are perfectly meaningful and so to communicate. Let's say there's a part of a test you've studied for, and you don't really know what the one part means, but you know the following 5 words in a row make a coherent sentence, and you can put that down. Then you kind of learn it the way an actor learns their lines, right? And there's a lot of, it seems obvious that there's a lot of that happening in human cognition, human thought. Because I've also, you discover it yourself. You think you understand something, and then you hit upon a part and you realize, but actually I have no idea what any of that part means. And I thought I did, but turns out I don't. Because your understanding did not consist in knowing what something is about, meaning how it relates to reality, but you can use words just fine if you know how they relate to other words, or you know roughly what kind of thing you can say if you know them, or you know certain strings are assertable, or something like that. So there's this idea of this nonsense. And well, what are its sources? Well, that's a live issue, right? That's not something that most philosophers of language focus on. That's a topic that I tend to focus on. So the first one I've already explained to you. Maybe the nonsense comes in part from a mismatch between natural language grammar and underlying logical form. It seems obvious it's not only that, though. Then I've mentioned the fact that we often don't need to know what we're talking about. I mean, that's just so, right? Embarrassingly, if I go to a car mechanic and they tell me, okay, your carburetor's broken, I have no idea what a carburetor is. But I don't need to, right? If someone asks me, well, what did the mechanic say? I can just repeat. I can say, oh, said carburetor's broken. And then they can repeat it to someone else, and they can repeat it to someone else, and so knowledge can spread. For the most part, this is a feature. It's not a bug. We don't need to know what we're talking about a lot of the time, or we only need to know partially what we're talking about. It's fine, as long as someone knows. I think I would bet any amount of money that sometimes you get cases where actually no one knows, or the original person was confused, and so it just sort of spreads, right? And everyone just assumes everyone else knows, and you end up in this sort of story about the emperor having no clothes. So I think that must be part of the story, right? Our ability for mimicry. And remember, again, most of the time, if your society tells you something you don't understand it, typically it does make sense, and typically they do understand it. The person who came to deliver my washing machine told me all kinds of stuff I don't understand either. I'm sure that's true, and I should just take it on faith. Or my car, or my fridge, or pretty much any sort of tool. I spoke to my third years. They can use the notion, they can talk about operating systems. Some prefer Windows, some Mac, but they have no clue what an operating system really is, right? Often partial understanding is good enough. Very rarely do you need full understanding. And this is mostly a good thing, because if knowledge could only spread if everyone knows what they're talking about, it couldn't spread very far or very quickly, right? It's good that we do this mimicry, but it creates the potential for these kinds of problems. Then a third thing that I think must be the case is, well, what's often called imagistic cognition. We think in terms, not only, but we often think in terms of spatial or physical metaphors. The classic example there is the way we spatialize time. So we talk about the past as behind us. We need a spatial metaphor of behind and in front. The future is in front of us, the past is behind us. Or if we talk about power, we say this person is above me. Or you say this person is below me. We spatialize power as well. And we do that for a lot of terminology, right? We sort of map it onto these imagistic sort of spatial metaphors. I think part of the answer to where nonsense comes from is going to be that. Occasionally you get something that works in the metaphor, but only in the metaphor, not when you try and apply it to reality, not when you try and take it literally. So I try to tell you one thing that's pretty much, the detail highly unsettled, but the rough idea is settled. There's what the words mean, there's what people mean. Then this is utterly unsettled. Not much attention to this topic nowadays. It was a huge topic beginning of the 20th century. It has mostly faded. There are quite only a few of us still trying to figure this out. And we are trying to figure it out because we do think philosophy has a lot of this gibberish. That philosophy suffers from the fact that in ordinary life, you often don't need to know what you're talking about. So I always tell my students, the method of philosophy is a good one. Take everything literally and see how far you get. And by literally, I mean really think. What am I talking about? Not what word comes next. Don't turn yourself into an LLM, right? I think in effect what we often do when we just parrot or mimic is we know how to complete strings. And then people will smile and nod. But that's not the same thing as knowing what you're talking about. And my example, and this is the third thing that I'm going to be talking about, is something worth knowing. but I'm more going to use this as an example of what I mean by this. So this is not a dramatic example. This is not Heidegger's the nothing nothings, right? And there's also not an example where underlying logical form is distinct from surface grammar. This is just a perfectly ordinary phrase that you encounter a lot in academia, especially in humanities and social science. And as mentioned at the beginning, it's the one that drives me crazy. So in academia, you can almost always say, meaning. Meaning is determined by context. And people will nod, and you will gain some profoundness points. You've said something quite profound. And I've had this in talks. This is slightly fictionalized, but in a neighboring discipline that I won't name. Went to a talk, someone talked about meaning is determined by context. I'm a philosopher of language. I asked them afterwards, so what exactly do you mean by meaning? And how is it determined? And then they just tell me more stuff. Oh, it's ever fleeting, it changes, it varies across cultures. I'm like, yes, fine. But what is this thing that you're saying varies across cultures, is ever fleeting? And then they just keep producing more strings. And pretty soon it's obvious they have no clue what they're talking about. So take this claim. Take it literally and see how far we get. Well, firstly, the word meaning can mean different things. Or a better way to express it, we can use the word meaning to communicate different ideas, right? So the first one, obviously, is moral significance. If I ask you, what is the meaning of 9/11? Or I ask you, what is the meaning of a university? Then I'm asking for the social role or the moral significance or something like that. So that's one kind of thing, right? Has nothing to do with philosophy of language, and it's utterly unlike the other things. So that's one sort of thing people mean. Not going to say anything about that. But the important point is, we're never going to have a theory of meaning that includes moral significance and the other ones that I'm going to talk about now. Then there's the ones I've spoken about. Well, there's what the words mean. So linguistic convention, that's semantics. I told you about that. And then there's what speakers mean, and that's pragmatics. I've told you about that. And these we can also subdivide various ways. Not going to bore you with that. So firstly, if someone says meaning is determined by context, a good start is, to ask, well, when you say meaning, what are you talking about? Are you talking about the moral significance? So you're telling me the meaning of 9/11 is ever changing? That's true, sure. That seems unexceptional. If you tell me linguistic convention is ever changing, well, that's just not so. The dictionary 10 years from now is mostly identical to the one now. Only a small subset of words change on a 10-year sort of rolling basis. And then what speakers mean, well, of course, that can vary from second to second, right? So that's wildly variable. So the important point is, if you disambiguate this claim, you get three very different claims, and some which are true, some are false, some debatable. And then there's the other part of this. So if someone says meaning is determined by context, well, what do you mean by determine? There are three different things we can, in theory, mean by determine there, or at least three phenomena we can hit on, where we say, this shows that, meaning is determined by context. The first, of course, is context can always play a causal role, right? It can always be part of how it came about that a certain thing is the case. But that's pretty trivial, because by that standard, if you ask me, well, what is the color of your car? I go, determines on context, meaning depends on what someone painted it. Well, sure. If context just means something that had a causal influence on something else, then everything is contextual. But that's pretty trivial. Would you agree with me? So, of course, it's the case that, Francesco means Francesco, and if Francesco's parents had called him something else, it would not. But, that's a sort of causal story that applies to everything on earth. That's not particularly interesting. What's more interesting, in the case of two, in the case of what words mean, there we can find a role for context having a constitutive role, meaning literally determining what something means. But it's a reasonably well, if we zoom out, not if we zoom in. If we zoom out, it's a reasonably well understood phenomena of very sort of limited applicability. So there are terms where what they refer to changes from moment to moment or from person to person, but what they mean in a certain sense, or at least the linguistic meaning, stays the same. These we call indexicals and demonstratives. So indexicals are terms like I, here, and now. If I say, I am hungry, I mean JP is hungry. If Francesco says I'm hungry, it means Francesco is hungry. Everybody clear? So it has the same linguistic meaning. And this meaning just is a rule that tells you what object should count as the meaning in this context. And the same with here and now. If I tell you I am here, I mean Nielsen Cinema. Someone else says, I'm here, they might mean, Germany. Same with now. If I say, well, we have to leave now, I mean a certain specific time. If I say it later, it means that other time, right? So here we have a way in which context clearly determines the meaning of a claim. But it's pretty much rule-bound. It's not terribly complicated, well, complicated in detail, but it's not terribly exciting. It's not the kind of thing that you would expect a sociologist to opine on with a sort of, profound expression on their face. So in the case of linguistic convention, context can play a very limited constitutive role, but it is there and it's kind of interesting. I've written papers about the terms this and that. And then, of course, in the case of three, what speakers mean, that can play a causal role. Context can cause me to mean something, meaning, if someone didn't smack me on the head, I would have tried to communicate something different from if someone hadn't smacked me on the head. So again, that's the trivial causal role. But there it plays mostly an epistemic role. Epistemic meaning it doesn't determine anything, but it allows you to know what's in my head, right? So if I tell you, this is great work, and it's clearly not, then based on the fact that A, it's not good work, A, I'm B, I'm reasonably honest, and you're familiar with the phenomenon of sarcasm, then you can figure out when I say this is great work, what I mean is this is terrible work. Everybody clear? So context, the fact that I'm a reasonably honest human being, the fact is this is terrible work, that allows you to get in my head, but it doesn't determine anything, right? It has an epistemic role, and an incredibly important epistemic role. Because it's not only what allows you to get into my head, it's what guides me in making my choice for an expression. I know that I know this, I know that you know this, I know that I know that you know this, so on and so forth, about me being reasonably honest, about this being terrible work, and that's why I can say something sarcastically. I can say this is great work, but communicate this is terrible work. But their context has an epistemic role. It allows you to get into someone's head. It doesn't determine anything. Everybody clear? So if we take these three meanings of meaning, and we take the three meanings of determined, the causal, the constitutive, and the epistemic, that means meaning is determined by context. We can distinguish 9 different disambiguations of that phrase. And until you've disambiguated it in that way, you haven't said anything that's truth evaluable, meaning that's true or false. It's just some broad thing, right? And yet, you don't have to go very far in our building to say, people always hear people saying stuff like, meaning is determined by context. Even though I can promise you the vast majority couldn't possibly tell you exactly what they're trying to communicate. It's a string that has a certain social role, and it moves the conversation along, but it's in a certain sense, the positivist sense, should still count as nonsense. But that's also what this method is good for. It's shockingly difficult, very, very often. On sentences you use all the time, you think you understand, in fact you might think they're true. To think really, okay, what makes it the case that this is true or false? Weirdly enough, that is quite a useful sort of philosophical method. In fact, I'm writing a book and I've written some papers arguing that 20th century philosophy of language have failed this test itself and failed it too often. And in fact, large parts of 20th century philosophy of language itself should count as, dreadfully confused for these kinds of reasons. So that's sort of what motivates my work in the first instance. Whenever we inquire into the world, whenever we do anything from physics to philosophy to journalism, we're using language. That's the tool that we're doing it with. And it seems pretty clear that this tool has some weird properties. We don't need to understand what we're talking about in order to produce various sentences. Often that's a good thing, sometimes that's a bad thing. And the project is about trying to understand this tool better. And thank you very much. I will leave the screen open with this lovely quote by Schopenhauer.
Thank you very much. Need to be very careful what I say now. I want to say thank you very much for the great talk. So you can give the meaning to that you prefer. Yeah. Are there any questions? Comments, please?